Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, it's a little confusing because I have to do a little bit of an intro here, Sean, to explain what we're talking about because it's not what we were planning on, but you didn't know anyway because it's all a surprise. Let me back up here for a second. This is the last podcast we are recording in my 20s because my birthday is October 8th and I am turning 30. Sean, you are following not that far behind me. Your birthday is in November. Yes. I'm sorry.
There's going to be a beautiful window where you're an old man and I'm still young and vibrant.
Yes. I'm sure you're going to make great use of that time.
Yes.
And, yeah. So anyway, because we're both turning 30, I thought it would be funny to do... Each of us would have a birthday podcast this year, where for our birthday, we would do a podcast where we would get to choose what the topic would be, and the other person wouldn't get to argue about it. It would just be a surprise, like within reason. You know, I wasn't going to make Sean like, Sean, my birthday podcast is you have to read Mein Kampf out loud on the podcast. That, you know, that kind of thing off limits. But, you know.
I mean, that would say a lot more about you than it would me. If you want to do that, you know, that's on you, man. That's on your fucking head.
That would be like if I was anticipating you one day running for public office, and I'd be like, I'll keep this in my back pocket for the blackmail. So it would be some kind of fun surprise. I had the absolute perfect thing planned, and I'm still going to keep it a secret because it's crazy. It's something where you guys know nothing about it. Sean knows nothing about it, and you will come out of it. Sean will probably think I'm crazy and call the cops on me. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be fun.
There's a folder in our shared Google Drive that just says Jonathan's birthday podcast docs that I have not opened that folder or looked at anything inside of it, and it just scares me now that I see it.
It involves, I'll just say this, it involves a game that we were going to play, and we needed my brother Thomas, who helped me put this all together and would have been like the referee commissioner kind of helping us. A lot of like the scorekeeping and stuff would have been on his side. And so this is what we were going to do. Thomas and I had been planning it. We did a dry run of it the other day. We were all ready to go. We had basically just told Sean, hey, have this, this, and this, you know, and it'll be fine. But Thomas, in the middle of all this, was supposed to be flying. He lives in Portland, Oregon. He was going to be flying to Colorado for a couple of weeks, and he would have had everything he needed to record. But he was flying to Colorado for a wedding. So he was supposed to fly out at like 9 p.m., but by the time I went to bed at about midnight, he still had not left the airport because his flight had gotten delayed. And then when I woke up, he said they delayed it a full 24 hours, and he had gone back home. And so he could not record the podcast with us. And so I said, okay, don't worry, Thomas. He was very disappointed because he was really excited to do it. And I said, oh, don't worry. We'll push it off. That's fine. We can record this whenever. It won't be for my birthday, obviously, because we have other plans for next week. And we still need to finish the Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood thing. That is next week, if you're wondering, is when we're finishing Full Metal Alchemist. But we will do it later in October. We will still do it. But so instead of the big elaborate thing Thomas and I had planned, because he is stuck in airport hell, what I have done is, you know, I realized it was a couple hours before recording, we didn't have anything ready, so I went down into the Weekly Stuff Batcave. I had to go through the mysterious network of tunnels under my house, and I have entered the Forbidden Room. It requires several layers of retinal and fingerprint verification. I took up the Hammer of Podcasting, which you and I both swore an oath to the old gods to only use when in dire need of content. And I used the Hammer of Podcasting to break open the single oldest break glass in case of emergency topic that you and I have had down in that bunker for over 10 years, the entire lifespan of that podcast. And that topic that we are going to, I'm making you do on live on air with me today, Sean, is the top 10 best video game controllers.
Oh, God. Jesus Christ. I was like thinking while you were doing your spiel, like, what the fuck is he even talking about? This is like an old reference, effectively, to an ancient podcast erased and scoured from the internet that we did do. This is the second time we will do a top 10 video game controllers podcast. The last time being when we were like 19 or no, younger than
No,
that,
younger,
17 or
younger.
18.
16 or 17. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have the numbers. I am 100% positive no one listening to this has heard this old podcast. But when you and I were first experimenting with podcasts, this is before the current run of the weekly stuff, episode 1 to now we're on 446. I started so I had a column in the Denver Post section that I wrote for, which was called Your Hub, and it was called the Monthly 10, and I did a monthly top 10 list about something, and I think it was 2011, I think it was New Year's Day 2011, I decided to do, well, before I had decided to do it earlier, but I released the first audio version of that because I wanted to play around with podcasting, and that was just like the top 10 movies of the previous year. I guess that would have been 2010 or something. And that was one that I just recorded. I think Thomas might have been in the room, but it was mostly just me. And then for the second episode, I decided I would have different people on for different episodes, and I brought you on for episode 2, and episode 2 was the top 10 best video game controllers. And then after that, it mostly just became a me and you podcast, because we had the best... We talked about this kind of shit all the time. People know the story. But anyway, it has been an in-joke between you and me for over 10 years now that if we ever ran out of ideas, the idea would be we do another top 10 video game controllers episode. And so this morning, when the truly elaborate thing I had planned broke down, I just went, okay, let's break the glass. It's been 10 years. I think we held out long enough. Let's do it. Let's do top 10 video game controllers. Let's do it.
There have been several video game controllers that have entered the market since the last time we did this podcast, which was at the end of the Xbox 360 PS3 generation, for context. So this is pre-PS4, this is pre-Xbox One. So, there's a whole host of brand new fancy controllers that we can rank.
Pre-Wii U and Nintendo Switch.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it's just, the whole landscape and concept of the video game controller truly is different now than it was when we were, bright-eyed young lads in your basement talking about video game controllers for no discernible reason whatsoever.
Yes.
But now we are old and grizzled, much more cynical people, and now we have good reason to talk about video game controllers because you're going to be 30 soon.
Yes.
This is what you want to do at the end of your 20s to bring in a new decade of your life. Is you want to talk about video game controllers?
Well, I also want to do a top 5 D-pads list. I have that on here too.
Okay then.
Yeah. No, Sean, I didn't want to do this. I had something else planned. But, break glass in case of emergency. I couldn't, I don't know. I guess I could have texted you at 9 in the morning and been like, watch James Cameron's Aliens, and we'll do an Aliens podcast. It's a follow-up on Avatar. But I just you know what? Well, I have had a doc on my computer for a while with a version of this that I've been toying around with just for fun on my own. So I'm like, you know what? We're going to pull it out. We're going to dust it off. You know what? This one's going to get a bunch of hits. I just know it. I just know Weekly Stuff Podcast number 446, the top 10 video game controllers. People are going to listen to it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, I had no idea that this is what we were going to be talking about. How are you planning on doing this, Jonathan?
Well, we'll get into it in a little bit. First off, I just wanted to check in. Do you have any stuff that we need to break down? There was really no news this week, so I thought I would do a quick stuff portion.
I do want to talk about. Let's do one quick news thing because I just wanted to engage in a little bit of Schadenfreude. It's not unrelated to the video game controller thing.
Yes, let's do it. Schadenfreude. I had forgotten about this because I'd forgotten about the thing. But go ahead, let's do the news. News.
Google Stadia is officially discontinuing early next year in January 2023. It will be barely 3 years old by the time it has shuffled off this mortal coil. And Google is leaving the video game business. Hopefully for good, and it is the most predictable thing that has ever happened in the history of the video game industry. It is I swear if you could pull up the fucking Nostradamus prophecies or whatever, and he has it in detail. It is the most accurate prophecy Nostradamus made, was Google's going to make some dumb video game bullshit. They're going to give it a year before they half kill it. Then it's going to limp on for a couple more years until they just officially discontinue it, and everyone will go on with their lives forgetting that it ever happened in the first place. That is exactly the scenario we are in. Google Stadia is dead, and nobody is shocked.
That's, I think, the funniest thing about it is it's just this was dead the day they announced it. Not necessarily because like the technology wasn't there or those sorts of things. I think Stadia as a product was actually probably better than most people thought it would be. But because it was Google. And Google does a lot of things very well. You and I engage with it all the time for Google Drive I know you use it every single day because of classroom stuff. And the things they do well and they support, they're pretty good with, but the number of things they actually, I feel like they stick with is pretty fucking small. And the number of times where they just throw shit at the wall to see what sticks, but don't have the follow through of like an Apple or a Microsoft or a Samsung or something in like, okay, let's actually put in the like time and money to like make this thing work. It's just not what they do. It's certainly not what they do with gaming. And it's not just Google. It's since Microsoft entered the business with Xbox, we've seen a lot of people try to break into, there's the three big ones, Xbox, Sony, Nintendo, and everyone's done it so half-assed. I remember the N-Gage. Do you remember the N-Gage? Yeah.
I mean, we'll have to talk about it in consideration for one of the best video game controllers, the Nokia N-Gage. Because it's the history of video games has been a long history of big media companies trying to break into the business. And Sony and Microsoft are like the two who did it. Right? Because both Sony and Microsoft were companies before they entered video games well known for lots of other products and are still like well known for those other products. Obviously, Microsoft is much better known for Windows than they are for Xbox. I think like PlayStation is probably one of the biggest pieces of the Sony mindshare at this point. But back in the day, they were like a hardware company that made TVs and Walkmans and shit like that. But you have, that whole graveyard of like Panasonic designed consoles and shit like that. That in the 90s that just all crashed and burned when the CD became like the hot new thing, and so everyone wanted their like CD based console. And that like trend in the 90s of all those consoles that died out has just like shifted into now it's Google Stadia and it's Amazon Luna and it's all that kind of stuff. Where the Nokia N-Gage is an earlier example of it from this sort of more modern period of these other companies trying to get into the video game business. And they all do it in this like half-hearted, let's give it a half of a shot kind of way. And then when it doesn't work out, they just sort of like quietly discontinue it or just ignore it and don't really support it anymore. And it's that thing where you just look at these massive media companies do this shit. And you're like, why do it? Like, why waste your money on something that you don't care about? Like, they created an internal first-party studio with Google Stadia that they had like made more or less when they announced that they were making Google Stadia. And they shut that studio down after like a year of it existing. And it never put out a full product because, of course, it didn't, because it was only up and running for about a year. It's a video game company. You can't make a game that fast, particularly not these days. And then after that happened, which was like almost 2 years ago at this point, it's just like, well, what is Stadia then? You didn't even give it a try. Like, you didn't even try it. And now it's this weird thing that doesn't have any internal support to actually like provide it with compelling software. So at that point, that was when Stadia like basically died. Now they're sort of officially saying, yeah, no, we know Stadia's over. Nobody really uses it. Nobody thinks about it. We're just going to quietly discontinue it at this point.
To Google's credit, I guess, they are refunding everything. They are giving all the money back for any games you bought. Any of the hardware, that kind of stuff. I think a lawyer probably told them, look, it's going to be cheaper to do that than to fight the lawsuit that will inevitably come. And so I think that's why I don't think it's out of charity, but this could go worse is, I guess the thing to say.
I mean, it's the thing that people need to remember also, because it's the shocking thing about Google Stadia you relearn every single time you think about it, is that it's not a Game Pass, Netflix style subscription thing. It was you buy the fucking game. Like, they had a PS Plus, like old school PS Plus that had like, two games in a month. Like, they did have that thing, but that was like a little trickle of games that you did that subscription for. In general, it was just a digital marketplace where you bought the games wholesale, but you only had access to them through the streaming, which is an insane business model that makes no sense whatsoever. And it just like boggles the mind every time you think about it, which is one of the reasons why I think they have to refund it, because they would be facing like a whole host of class action lawsuits. I don't give a shit what their EULA says. Like you're going like people are going to say, "Hey, what the fuck? I paid $60 for whatever games were available on Stadia, Red Dead Redemption 2, and now you're just taking it away from me, even though I paid you money to buy this game, and you're not like I have no means of accessing it in any way whatsoever." Like they're going to face a bunch of like lawsuits for that kind of shit, so they're going to have to refund it to a certain extent.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I think if Stadia had had a different business model, it could have been some kind of success because the technology, I don't think it's there 100%. I don't think anyone has cracked game streaming perfectly. It's definitely gotten better, but I do think we're just a ways off in no small part because of just the general internet infrastructure in the US is just not.
Yeah.
And it's not something Google can control unless Google, I guess there's like, they have some projects like Google Fiber, but they don't lay the internet themselves, right? And so I think if it had been some kind of Game Pass style subscription, it would have to be cheaper than Game Pass, I think $5 to $10 a month. And it had a good range of games that you could go in and play. I think that, and I think aimed towards more casual gamers who wouldn't buy consoles. Like, that's the thing. Stadia was weirdly aimed at people who already played games heavily, which no one who does that needs Stadia, right? And I think if you tried to aim it at a broader audience, I think there's potential for buy-in there. I would look to, like, some combination of what Game Pass is and what Apple Arcade is. Apple Arcade is Apple's sort of curated $5 a month set of games that run on your iPhone, your Mac, your iPad, any Apple TV, all of those devices. That's not a streaming service, but I can imagine the kinds of games that are on Apple Arcade, some of which are very acclaimed. People like that service. Like that being in the cloud somehow and streaming, I could see that taking off in some, not immediately like we're going to topple Nintendo way, but in a like, it could be a durable hit. But you'd have to have the follow through. You'd have to really be invested in it. You'd have to, have some time on your hands and not feel like we're immediately going to take down Microsoft or something, which I think is Google's weird standard here is like, well, it didn't topple Microsoft, so I guess it's not worth it, which is a dumb standard to get into the industry with.
Yeah. And I think a big thing that they needed to do was to like robustly support their own platform with first party development. Like that
Yes.
is, if there's anything that we have learned from the history of the video game market, is that is the only way for you to succeed. Like you can't wait for other people to make games for your thing. You gotta go buy Bungie and make them take that Halo thing and put it on your system and keep it on your system, right? Like you have to do something like that. You need to robustly support your own platform, because that is then the thing that will allow it to grow and for other people to come, rather than like hoping that hoping that people will come making some third-party deals. There's Jason Schreier, this was reported a while ago, but he brought it back up with this announcement, talked about how Google has paid like tens of millions of dollars to studios like Rockstar to port games like Red Dead Redemption 2 to Stadia, like an absolutely unbelievable quantity of money to port their games. And that's the most they did, is let's take these games that are a couple years old, pay these studios money to port them over to Stadia, and like let's build up a studio, but let's not understand the realities of game development to actually allow that studio to make a game. So when all you have is a small library of older games available on your platform, the only way to play them really is to pay full price for them, and then you only get a streaming version of it, so you're always getting a compromised version of that game, even if you're in a scenario where maybe you would be able to have a device to run it natively. Like, there's just so many things against Stadia in terms of how they set it up, and since there's no killer app, there is nothing that they could design and release as a game to make their platform attractive, that here's the thing you gotta come to Stadia for to play, and guess what, you can try it for 2 hours for free on your fucking phone, and then if you buy our $5 a month thing, then you can play this game whenever you want, right? And you get this whole host of other titles. And if you had come out of the gate with something, with a single game maybe that was at least kind of good, that would be your starting point. But they didn't do any of that. They came out, talked a lot of shit about how there were going to be games on this platform that takes advantage of this streaming stuff, and these like super Google server shards and all this shit that we'll be able to do stuff that games running on your PlayStation or your PC are not going to be able to do because of the resources that we can leverage with streaming. And they talked about that a hell of a lot in the first, like, the announcement and those like weeks leading up to the release of the platform. And there was never a single game that took advantage of any of those features. There was never a single game that took advantage of any of the features they touted that would integrate with YouTube in different ways, that would integrate with streaming and audience interaction, like streaming for like other people watching you play your game. There were so many features that they came up with and said, hey, this is going to be awesome. And basically none of them actually happened. And if you go back and like watch the announcement thing they did, which we talked about on the podcast in 2019 when they did it, because I watched it, like it is full of all these, like, you look at it now, and we knew at the time, completely empty fucking promises. And then 3 years later, they have to shut down the service. It's just like completely embarrassing.
Totally embarrassing. It's Google. They have more money than God, so they don't care. But God, it's just, I don't know how many times the rest of the industry needs to learn the lesson. And it's just sad to see that kind of money just utterly pissed away.
Yeah.
You could go a decent way to solving homelessness for the amount pissed on Google Stadia, but no.
Yeah, and like they did create like a lot of really impressive tech. Like Google Stadia worked well. Like at the time, it worked better than any other game streaming thing I had tried. It still had its foibles, but it was by far the best. And I didn't even have their fancy controller or whatever that like connected directly to their servers to reduce latency and all that kind of shit. It's just like they made an impressive piece of technology. There were like clearly a lot of really talented engineers and designers and stuff working at Google on this project. And I remember like feeling like kind of heartbroken when I saw some interviews around E3 in 2019 where Stadia people were there, and there was like a Giant Bomb video where they're interviewing some of the Google Stadia people. And feeling like, man, these people seem really smart and passionate and are putting in clearly a lot of work. And at the time, it was obvious to everybody that this thing would fail. Like, it had if you know anything about the history of video games in the video game industry, like every single thing about Google Stadia made it clear it was going to be a failure of a product and in a business sense, and that would not be able to take off. But it was like, man, these are some really talented people that they got to work on this thing that are doing incredible work, but they're not being supported by the like management and like the bigger picture stuff and the business choices and things that they have no part in. And it's very frustrating to see all of that hard work and creativity go to waste. It's frustrating to hear the stories of lots of developers, particularly some smaller developers that had partnered with Google to release Stadia versions of their games, which, to be clear, you have to make a port, or you had to make a port to Stadia. You did not just release the PC version of your game on Stadia. It wasn't like, here's my PC game, let me put it on the Steam Marketplace, let me put it on the GOG Marketplace, let me put it on the Windows Marketplace, but it's effectively the same game. You do minimal to almost no work to put it anywhere else because it's just the same executable and everything. You had to make a port of Stadia. It was its own unique platform. So these indie devs are like putting in work to make a Stadia port of their game, excited to get it out there and to, get the money from Google and all that shit. And then they found out that Stadia didn't exist the moment everybody else found out. I think we now know that Google is like recompensing them in some way, which that has to be a legal requirement. You can't just sort of say, oh, sorry guys, we're just going to stop, and we're not going to give you any money for all the work you did when we said that, oh, we are going to give you this money once it's released on our platform. I'm sure there are like contract things that require them to pay those studios money, but it still is like, it's a really shitty fucking thing to do, to not even let your partners and people you're working with know, oh, by the way, we're going to shut down the platform in a couple of months and your game will never release on Stadia. Or maybe you can put it out, it'll be on the platform for 2 weeks before it's gone in early January 2023.
It's just, there's so many object lessons here. I think the main one, again, is if you really want to enter the video game market, you have to be ready to let your company be in part a video game company. Not just Google, we fuck around, we throw money at Rockstar, and then we get the money. We let other people be the video game companies. It's just not how it works. Sony and Microsoft had to allow their companies to be partially video game companies. Remember when Microsoft decided for a little while that's not what Xbox would be? Yeah, that was bad. They're still reeling from that, Yeah. It's like this is just not how this shit works. They're fucking idiots. It's stupid. I think we've come to an equilibrium now where game streaming exists, and I think for the foreseeable future will exist as a add-on value add to existing like subscription services. So Game Pass Ultimate has theirs. And then Sony through PS Plus has theirs. That's a little different than what Game Pass does. Specifically on PlayStation, it's that PS Now stuff that allows you to pay like PS3 games and other games that if you don't want to download them. And both of those are pretty impressive. The Xbox One, I've launched that on my desktop and my iPad and stuff, and it works if you have a good connection. It's not the ideal way to play, but it's not positioned to be the ideal way to play, so I don't think anyone gets mad at it. And the same with Sony. I think it's a little frustrating you can't natively play PS3 games, but it is better than nothing. And I will say, a couple weeks ago, I did boot up. I do have the highest tier of PS Plus because I realized I could upgrade to it for the rest of my subscription for like less than $20. So I'm like, I want to try this out. And I did stream some of God of War, the PS3 remaster of the original PS2 God of War. And once it was up and running, I couldn't tell the difference between it and a game I had natively on the console. It ran, other than it looked a little more jagged than I think the actual game would, it looked and played really responsively. And I was like, I could imagine myself playing this. And as a value add, I think that's good. And I think that's where it will be until the technology is in a better place. It's very hard for me to imagine anybody trying to do the Stadia thing again anytime in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's just, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, particularly if you're not even doing the subscription thing. It makes zero sense. But even if you're doing the subscription thing, like, I think there is a fantasy that a lot of these big like companies have getting into video game stuff of that, like, the barrier to people playing console style, like, controller complex modern video games is that, like, the consoles are too expensive or something like that. Like, I think this is a thing that, like, Xbox and Sony talk about sometimes, is like, this is like the future, as there's this whole untapped market out there of people who could be playing these games, but they're not because they don't own the device. But if you could just stream it to your TV. And I think that's like, I think there are some people that might hit, but I think it kind of is like you don't understand what is the actual barrier of entry, which is that it's very hard to play these games. Like, you have to build up a lot of like muscle memory and dexterity and coordination to be able to play a modern video game with a controller. Whereas there are, like, that big untapped market, lots of those, if not most of those people are playing games. They're just playing games on their phones, because because they're like intuitive, and the games and the scale and the style of games is more appealing to someone in that space, rather than trying to sort of get invested in Red Dead Redemption 2 and learning how to play that game and all the complex things you need to do on the controller. And I think that's, like, for me, that's part of the folly of the streaming future that people see, is I think they think that the access is the barrier when it's not actually the access, and people can have access to those games and they're not necessarily going to be interested in trying to learn how to play them on a controller. So I think that you're right, that it is a value add, is like the space for streaming. That is where it's effective for people who are already in the marketplace, who already know they like these kinds of games, but like have certain scenarios in their life where they might not have access to their TV all the time or whatever, that, like, it is a nice bonus that sometimes you can stream it to another device, or you can access it from another room or whatever, rather than having to move your console around and hook things up all the time. Like, it is a convenience feature that some people find some use for, but it is not, I think, and I don't know if it will ever really be for video games, the, like, key way that you ever access them.
No, because there will, no matter how good the internet gets, you will always be able to play better on dedicated hardware that is just right there in your room. And I don't know if you've met video game players, they go after this stuff, right? Like, it's crazy to think that, like, people who are into video games would go for the one with all the extra latency. If you know anything about video gamers, they care about their latency, a lot of them. And yeah, no, I think you're right, because I think people make a lot out of the cost, but, like, okay, the most expensive consoles right now are the Xbox, PS5, $500. Not cheap. Everybody has an iPhone or something that's more expensive than that. Like, the idea that, okay, I'm going to buy this console, it'll last me 7 to 10 years, $500, versus every year or two I buy $1,000 phone. Like, and I know not everyone does that, but you get my larger point. Like, it's it's a silly thing to think that's the thing that would be the barrier in a world where, electronics are everywhere and cost a lot, and video game consoles are not actually the most expensive thing people pay money for. In terms of like raw computing power, consoles are incredibly cheap for what they give you, actually.
Yes.
So yeah, it's an interesting discussion. You're right that I just think the industry has like misunderstood this broadly, and yeah, at the very least, I hope Stadia puts to death that vision of things for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think it has made a very dramatic example of itself of how streaming as like the exclusive means of accessing your game, it sounds fancy and futuristic and high tech, but it's got so many very obvious significant drawbacks, and in practice very few real benefits, because you are still locked to a specific location with a really good internet connection, right? So it's like the idea that like I can access my games wherever I want because I can stream them to my device is a complete fantasy. It is never part of the actual deal. So it's like the real practical benefits of it are actually quite limited, and one of the many reasons why Stadia failed.
I mean, and if that's the marketing fantasy is play your games wherever you want, that is a really appealing logline. We know that because the Nintendo Switch and now the Steam Deck are crazy popular, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the kind of thing that you should go after if you want the on-the-go crowd, or do more stuff on phones. Like, there's a million ways to do this. Streaming is not one of them. It's silly. Thank God it's dead.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other stuff before we move on to our main topic today, Sean?
I'll mention it briefly, just because it's very relevant to us. I played a little bit of Gundam Evolution, the hero shooter, on PC, and I assume it's on everything. I played it on the PC because I have my.
It's only on PC now. It'll come out on other things in late November, so I have not played it yet.
Yes, so it's a free-to-play hero shooter. Think Overwatch, but with Gundams. It is quite good. I think I don't think I'm going to get into it necessarily, but that's because I'm not really into hero shooters in general. Like, I never really liked Overwatch that much. I don't think it's a genre for me, but it's a lot better than I think I really expected going in, because I think I had pretty middling expectations for a free-to-play Gundam hero shooter. Does not immediately conjure images of a super high-quality product to me. But actually playing it, I think if you are into hero shooters, I think first and foremost, if you're into hero shooters and you want one that's fairly streamlined, I think Gundam Evolution is a game that you'd be interested in. It's not as complicated as something like Overwatch. It's fairly straightforward. The different mobile suits have only a couple of abilities. They all only have one weapon, so they're not super complicated to learn how to play, but they are very well differentiated in their this one's a tank, this one is a sniper, DPS, this one is a close range DPS, this one is a healer. So they are well differentiated, but they only kind of narrowly fit into those roles, in the sense that you don't have a wide range of things you have to learn how to do to play the characters well. So if you're someone that likes hero shooters and you're looking for something like that, Gundam Evolution is quite good. And then the Gundam stuff to me is kind of a bonus on top of it. It is not so laden with really deep Gundam references, or you're not customizing your Gundams and creating a unique one or something like Gundam Breaker 3. So if your main entry point is you are a Gundam fan, I don't think there's enough fan service there in the game for that to be a thing that pulls you all the way through and gets you really into the game. But if you like Gundam and you really like hero shooters, the Gundamness is a nice icing on top, and there are some fun little references and things you can unlock and stuff. There are quite a few mobile suits available at launch for people entirely for free. I think there's about a dozen or so, and then there's 4 or 5 that you can get if you pay. There's an in-game currency and all that kind of stuff that you can pay for. You can earn in-game currency as well, although it seemed to be at a very slow rate, so you eventually would be able to buy mobile suits, but you have to play the game quite a bit. And I had a decent time with it. I mostly played as the Gundam, because if I'm going to play a Gundam game, I'm going to play as the Gundam. It's if I'm going to play a Dragon Ball game, I'm going to start playing Goku, because I need to know, I want to see how the basic thing works. The Gundam actually fits my playstyle quite well. He's a fun kind of DPS character, with a kind of mid-range accurate beam rifle, so it's kind of almost like a DMR kind of role. The Gundam plays not as accurate or high damage as the sniper, but it can get in a little bit closer. You have the gun hammer is one of his abilities, which is very fun. So that's the giant flail. He spins it around and throws it at an enemy. You have a shield, so you can tank a little bit. And then his ultimate is he throws like a grenade, like a super napalm grenade, and he shoots it with the beam rifle and it explodes. That does a lot of damage. And I played a few rounds as the Gundam and did quite well with that, and enjoyed that character. It's got a little bit of almost a like the modern Battlefront game feel to it, in the sense of like there's a little bit of sort of like travel time for the projectiles with the beam weapons that feels a little bit like the Battlefront games. And I think like there's a lightness or like kind of a nimbleness or something to the shooting that feels kind of like those Battlefront games as well. And then I also played as trying to think of like what were the other mobile suits. There's the Gym Sniper, that is quite fun. There's the Pale Rider, which is one of the ones from, I think it's from one of the mangas. That's the kind of default one you get, that he has like some healing ability and stuff like that. And then I think the most fun one, I didn't play it as this mobile suit a lot, but I jumped in as the Turn A Gundam. The Turn A Gundam is incredibly fun because the Turn A Gundam has an ability where you just basically judo throw a fucking mobile suit. Like you grab him and then you like, it's like where it's that throw where like you roll backwards and then kick up and roll them kind of like over your head. And you just like fucking chuck mobile suits up into the air. It's completely ridiculous. It's pulled, obviously, it is a reference to a thing that Lauren does in the show. And it is very silly and very funny. And then my favorite part of the Turn A Gundam isn't even that. It's that the Turn A Gundam, when you use up your ammo in your beam rifle, you don't reload it. You just throw it away and get a different beam rifle. Like, you just pull another beam rifle out of nowhere, which is, again, like what in the show, they don't have the ability to recharge it. So they just, like, find another cache and he gets a different beam rifle. And so the Turn A Gundam, I think, was the one that is the most fun, partially because it's like when you have it lined up to a bunch of other mobile suits, mostly from Universal Century stuff, there's like Barbados is in there and he's a melee one, so there's a couple of non-Universal Century mobile suits. But the Turn A Gundam looks so different from all the other ones, and you have all this ridiculous shit you do where you're just chucking mobile suits and you're using up your beam rifle and throwing it away and just grabbing a different one and going on and fighting more. The Turn A Gundam, like, if I go back and play more of the game, I think I might switch to the Turn A Gundam as my main, just for the chuckles, because he seemed quite effective, but also it was incredibly silly, because you're just like, you know, it's all objective based stuff like a hero shooter is, so it's a lot of controlling zones like a Domination Call of Duty, and you could just like chuck a motherfucker out of the zone and just throw him over your head and just make it, it's like, get out of here, like I want to capture this thing. There's a lot of goofy stuff like that, so I think if you're into hero shooters, Gundam Evolution is very well worth checking out, especially because you can play like all those mobile suits I just mentioned and probably like 8 more. You can play entirely for free. There was nothing that felt like it was sort of trying to poke me to get me to pay for the season pass or anything. I was able to play an hour or two pretty much unencumbered by a desire to put any money into it. So I think if people are looking for something like that, Gundam Evolution is quite good.
Yes, I'm very excited to give it a try. Don't have a PC on me right now, although my brother is lending me an old laptop he has, so hopefully I can do some stuff like that. Because I would very much enjoy giving that game a try. Looking forward to it.
I don't think it's particularly heavy also in terms of like the hardware demands. It doesn't scale up to being like this super advanced looking game. It feels very modest. Like I was running it at 160 frames per second at full everything. And getting almost no frame drops, and not because like my rig is super awesome, but because like I think the game is designed in general for like a very wide range of PCs, and it looks nice. It's like well stylized, but it definitely is not going to like sort of set your PC on fire. So I think if people, it's definitely accessible, I think, to a very wide range of devices. So people should be aware of that. If that's something that like is a concern for you, you should check it out. And your PC can probably run it totally fine. Like I'm pretty sure that my shitty old laptop would be able to run Gundam Evolution fine enough if I put some of the settings down.
Yeah. It looks like it's coming to both PlayStations, both Xboxes, or all 4 Xboxes, whatever you want to say, in late November, I think November 30th. So at some point, everyone will be able to play it, and that looks fun. So that's Gundam Evolution. I'll say one game I've been playing really quick. I want to have an actual full discussion about this game later, but I'm not quite done with it. But I have been playing the campaign for Modern Warfare. Mm-hmm. For I should probably clarify what I mean. The campaign for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, which yes. I had said last week I wanted to go back and play that one, because I had played the multiplayer to death and I'd never played the campaign. So I had to re-download the game onto my Xbox. We've talked before about how on consoles the launcher for that game is so fucked it's hard to play anything on it. It is still so fucked. I downloaded everything, and then I launched the game and campaign wasn't playable, so I went and said, okay, what do you want me to download? And it said, okay, you have campaign packs 1 and 2, but you need the campaign pack unnumbered. So I went and got the campaign pack, downloaded that, went in and said, okay, you've got almost everything. You still need the campaign plus special ops pack. So I'm like, okay, go download that. Then I was able to play the campaign, except I wasn't actually, because I had it on my external hard drive for my Xbox. And I've been using this hard drive since the first Xbox One I got. So I've had this on here forever. You're supposed to, on the series games, be able to play off of the hard drive just like you would on an Xbox One, and it has worked for me on everything else. The game was not running right off of that hard drive. And I had seen a bunch of people complain. The game is not in any way optimized for Series S or PS5. It's just running in back compat. And so, like, one thing immediately is that all the cinematic cutscenes were playing, like, 1 frame every 30 seconds, like just completely frozen garbage, like just not working at all. Almost like it was streaming in, stuttering. It was totally fucked. But even in the levels themselves, sometimes it would be smooth and sometimes it would be unplayably choppy. And I'm like, okay, I know the game isn't broken like this. What's going on? I tried a bunch of fixes people had listed on the internet. None of them worked. Finally, I said, okay, maybe it's the hard drive. I'll put it on my internal storage. But the game is 200 gigabytes. And the Series S has about 350, and I had Forza, and I had Halo on there, Halo MCC, and those are collectively about 200. So I had to move all 200 gigs of that off to the hard drive, then move all 200 gigs of Call of Duty onto the console. I had it go overnight. It took forever. Then it did finally work, and I have been playing it. And that campaign is absolutely fascinating because I think on a game design level, it's an absolute masterpiece of modern first-person shooter level design. And then the story and politics are fucked, but in like genuinely interesting ways. It comes kind of close to launching a systemic critique of the American military-industrial complex. It doesn't, but it comes closer than Call of Duty usually does.
Yeah, I'm vaguely remembering that as well, because I've not touched that campaign since I played it originally, but I remember that being my impression as well. It's just like, oh, you could, like, if you just did 2 or 3 things here, if you could just see this and you just adjusted this slightly, it would totally transform its whole perspective. I would not get my hopes up, Jonathan, no. in the second half of the campaign or anything that is going to.
I have 3 levels
make
left.
Those leaps.
Yeah, I'm going to finish it tonight. It's honestly, the thing is, it has all these sequences where it has 2 major sequences where you play as your main sort of Middle Eastern characters in the game from the like fictional country you're in. And you play as them as kids when like their town was attacked by the Russians. And I think those sequences border on exploitative because of what they're doing with some of that imagery. But I actually think they would be like really good and powerful if it wasn't the fucking Russians, if it was the Americans.
Yes.
If it was not the Russians came and bombed it, which, to be fair, the Russians do evil shit. I mean, right now in Ukraine, right? Like, this is not like it doesn't happen. But this is a game about, like, Middle East politics. Like, in the modern context, this is the kind of stuff. Like, it starts with, like, a fucking drone strike where, like, her mother dies. Like, that's a thing America does. This should be a scene about America doing evil shit and you having to deal with it. And, like, how fascinating would it be if Call of Duty put that muscle behind the kinds of people American imperial campaigns actually hurt? That would be a really interesting, powerful use of that imagery. But because we've offloaded the fucking blame onto, like, cartoon Russians, it's cowardly, and I don't love that part of it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly kind of how I felt about it at the time. It is going back to some of the like the technical things of making it run. It is one of those great mysteries of how they have managed their data thing of like where like the concept seems to have been by splitting up the data and letting you pick what you want to have download. We'll be able to manage the download size of this thing. And yet somehow it is still like 200 gigabytes when all you're trying to do is download only the campaign pieces.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. You have to have everything. It just doesn't let you play if you don't have everything. So that idea of it being modular just is complete bullshit. And I haven't seen one that does it well. Like, I tried to reduce the footprint of the Master Chief Collection, and I just ripped out Halo 4. I'm like, I'm never going to play Halo 4. Let me get rid of that. It won't let you go into multiplayer. I was like, well, just have me not play on Halo 4 maps. What's the problem with that? You can turn off Halo 4 in the settings. I don't have it on anyway, but it won't let you do it. So so it's irrelevant that they have that feature to begin with.
Yeah, it's a thing where, like, the only way it works is if they are actually different games, right? Like, maybe you can switch over to it from the same launcher to launch it, but, like, if you have the multiplayer is a different executable that runs from the platform, and the campaign is a different executable that runs through the platform, then you can manage it fine. But yeah, trying to do the, like, content packs embedded within the larger game thing, it has yet to have worked.
Yeah. All right. So, Sean, do you want to talk about some video game controllers with me?
Sure, why not?
I could see in your eyes the answer was no, but you're going to humor me.
Okay. How are we doing this, Jonathan?
I have, if you go into the Google Drive, Sean, I have a document that just says game controllers, so you can follow along if you want. I made a list just of the big three, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft. What are their controllers? We'll go through them. This is just neutral. What are they? And then we can select which ones we want to consider. I threw some other ones at the bottom. We can talk about other ones. The first conversation I want to have, actually, is not about any of these controllers. I don't know why I remember this, but I do remember having a heated discussion on the old version of this when you and I were like 17 years old of whether mouse and keyboard should be one of the entries. I will argue now, I think as I did then, that it shouldn't. Not because mouse and keyboard, if it is, should be number one. But the problem is, mouse and keyboard isn't a standardized thing. There's a billion mice, there's a billion keyboards. Saying that versus the Super NES controller seems dumb to me because there's only one Super NES controller. There's not like a style of it. So that would be my argument that a mouse and keyboard is not a game controller. It's a separate thing. We're talking about gamepads.
Yeah, so I think I have no recollection of what we talked about on the original podcast. The only thing I remember about that original podcast was me talking about the Sega Genesis D-pad. That is the only memory I have at all of anything that was discussed on that podcast. I do not remember what the list was. I mean, I can make a guess as to, like, obviously which controllers came up. I remember going in thinking, like, the one thing I want to talk about is the Sega Genesis controller, because I was the only person I knew that played the Sega Genesis. So I don't remember what I said then. I think for the sake of this list, I think it is fine to exclude the mouse and keyboard, because it opens up like maybe we like video game console controllers is maybe what we're really saying here, because the PC is like its whole own world of joysticks and racing wheels and like fucking crazy bullshit that just is that a lot of which we don't have much or any experience with. Is like its whole own universe of video game controllers. So I think it is fair to say we are talking about consoles. We are not talking about the world of PC video game controllers. Because obviously, on the face of it, the mouse and keyboard is a controller that you use to control video games with. So it is obviously a video game controller, but it is not for the purposes of the discussion, like, particularly useful to include.
It's a category. It's a separate category of controller. Like, there I would be ranking, like, what are the best mice, what are the best keyboards, not... like, it as an abstract concept isn't, I think, fair to hold up against the DualShock 3 or whatever, right? Like, that's a different thing.
And we don't have the expertise of gaming mice and keyboards and all the associated peripherals to be able to have that discussion, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously the thing to say is like, then we would just include specific mice and specific keyboards in the discussion, and that would just be too much and crazy. We don't know enough about that.
Yeah, I do have a little bit more than you, because I care about this a little bit more, but, like, it's still not something I think about all day, every day, you know? It's a different thing. So, yeah, I think we were talking about game, and obviously when we say console controllers, the thing now is you can use all your console controllers on the PC, and many people do, but we are talking about game pads released originally for consoles. Let's start going through the Nintendo ones, Sean, and let's just start winnowing the list, all right?
Okay.
We have NES and Super NES. I don't think NES would be in serious contention. I think Super NES has to be, because the Super NES controller is the most influential of all time, and all gamepads are based on it.
And the NES controller is phenomenally uncomfortable to me, so
Yes.
I would not include that. The Super Nintendo, yes, that is definitely on the list.
Yeah, N64. Do you want to put N64 on the list?
We could put it on we could make a different list that we can put it on of worst or most. If we want to make a list of most baffling video game controllers, the N64 maybe probably wouldn't win. There's some fucking crazy shit out there, but of well-known controllers, it would win that list.
Of controllers you've substantively used, would you say the N64 is the worst?
Oh yeah, of ones that I've substantively used, yes.
Yeah, I would too. Yeah. It's a terrible design. I've actually been looking for, so people now today have made like peripheral companies have made modern versions of the N64 controller that give you all the buttons in the right places, but in a sane design, basically putting it on like a SNES style, PlayStation style controller. I have one of those on pre-order for using with my Switch because I like, if you're going to play Ocarina of Time or something, it maps best onto a N64 controller. The problem is the N64 controller sucks, so a modified N64 controller is perfect, right? But the original actual one is terrible, and I just needed to mention it because I did, before we recorded this morning, Sean, I was just looking for inspiration. I Googled, do people do this list, top 10 video game controllers? What have other people said about this? And I found a list on the first page of Google that had this at number 2 best of all time, and that person was a lunatic. The last sentence of their blurb was, yeah, it is a bit uncomfortable, but it's still amazing. And I'm like, what's amazing about it? The buttons suck. The fucking control stick is a piece of shit. You can't hold it right because it's got 3 prongs and humans have 2 arms. It's insane.
Yeah, I think it's the thing of where people have a lot of nostalgia. This is going to come up with probably the next controller we're going to say. People have a lot of nostalgia around the controller because they liked the games they played on it.
Right.
But just because you played really good games with a really shit controller doesn't make the controller good. The N64, I think, I would argue, is an objectively bad controller. Obviously, it's an important controller. It's an influential controller. It's not the first controller to have an analog stick. That's a misconception. But it's the first widely adopted controller that had an analog stick that wasn't a weird, like, Atari Jaguar bullshit thing. But the problem is, there are multiple features of the controller that are inaccessible to the player depending on how they hold the fucking controller. And that to me is like the number one, like on one of the conditions of, do you have not a good controller? Do you have a fully functioning controller? One of the conditions is all of the controls available to the player simultaneously whilst holding the controller. And if you cannot check off that box, you have failed a fundamental priority of your controller design. If I have to make a choice as a player, am I going to be able to access the L button in the D-pad, or am I going to be able to access the analog stick and the Z button? And I have to make that decision when I hold the controller, or God fucking help you, am I going to sacrifice all of my face buttons in order to have the L, D-pad, analog stick, and Z button, which I'm pretty sure there was one of the, like, insane GoldenEye configurations did that. If that's, like, the choices you're having to make, no other controller I have ever used has had to make me think, how am I going to hold this in order to play this video game? And that's not even getting into, like, I think the stick, a bold first attempt, but, there are people with scars on their palms from that fucking thing.
Yes.
And the horrors of the original Mario Party. I think the, like, seed, like, directional buttons are a bizarre thing, that, like, just conceptually makes no sense and is always one of the things about the controller that is bizarre to try to map onto other controllers and stuff if you're trying to use, like, play an N64 game on PC. The concept of the C directional buttons is insane. It is a bad controller. I get why people have a nostalgia for it, because it's one thing you can say about it is it certainly has a lot of personality to the design.
Yes.
But it is a fucking nightmare that I'm glad we can bury in history.
Yeah, and I've sent you, Sean, just a link to this. This is an item I've kickstarted. There's a company called Brawler, or Retro Fighters. They have a controller called Brawler 64, which was made, it's literally a wireless controller for actual N64 consoles. And they're kickstarting a version of it for the Switch, and you can also use it on your PC because it's just Bluetooth. And I just wanted to show this because it's like, this looks like if sane people made the N64 controller, and it's fine. Look at it's like, this didn't have to be insane. You can get it all on there in a normal way.
Yeah, it's still like, it's just got like the, the 6 face button thing, which is obviously where we did not go in that direction with our controllers. Generally, like, it is constrained by some of the other design issues with the N64 controller. But if you want to be able to play an N64 game and not break your hands, this is a bold effort.
Yeah, and just it didn't have to be insane. Okay, N64 off the list. We're not considering it. I'm sorry. If you're an N64 stan, leave a comment. We may or may not read it. GameCube. The GameCube controller obviously has to be reckoned with here. So let's get into it. I think the GameCube I still like the GameCube controller specifically for Smash Brothers. There has never been a firmer link between one game and one controller than Super Smash Bros. And the Nintendo GameCube controller. Obviously, to the end of time, that's just, they are etched in history together, and it makes sense. There are other things I like about the GameCube controller. I've always liked the feeling in hand. I've always liked the look of it. I've loved the colors. I like the idea of big green A button and everything else kind of around it. I think there's fun design ideas. I've never been a fan of this stupid, crazy triggers with multiple stops, and that stuff's dumb. It's got one of the worst D-pads of all time. It's got a D-pad that's borders on useless and non-functioning. And there's other issues as well. I am fond of it. It's not a top 5 for me, the way it is for some people. I do think there's some nostalgia baked in. I also don't think it's like a bad controller people have nostalgically turned into a good one, the way the N64 has been done. It's genuinely inspired in some ways. It's just not modern in other ways. We didn't mention the C-Stick is terrible. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing with the GameCube controller is, I mean, I think it will be on our list. I think it will be in that bottom section. Because, yes, I agree that there are some things about the design I do like. And it's particularly, I think the layout of the face buttons is interesting, and it has, like, a compelling argument for, let us make the most used button the biggest, most accessible button on the controller, like, is an interesting concept. And I think, like, there is some value in thinking about how you lay out your face buttons differently. I think, like, it has the problem of, like, the X button on the GameCube controller feels, like, weirdly vestigial because it's so far cast off to the edge of the controller. Notably, that is a button that is effectively pointless in Smash because it just does the same thing the Y button does. Everything about the GameCube controller feels like it exists to make Smash Bros. Melee play well. And for almost any other game, it is an inferior controller to its major competitors, the PlayStation 2 and Xbox controllers. So it's like the C-Stick works great as a Smash stick in Smash Brothers, but no other video game ever made in the history of mankind demands a weird little shitty nubby analog stick that you just smack as hard as you can in a specific direction to do a single attack. That is a thing that only one video game has ever done. And so when every other game is moving into full 3D games with full 3D camera movement, and thus the 2 analog stick thing has become a standard at this point, and it is being very well deployed on the PlayStation and the Xbox. The GameCube has this weird shitty little nub that you have to contend with, or you're still doing your, like, old school PS1 N64 style. The only real camera control you have is just occasionally recentering the camera behind your character by pressing L or something. So that's a pretty big deficiency in terms of the controller's design. It is lacking one of the bumper buttons, which is also an issue with it, right? It only has the 1Z button, despite the fact that there is more than enough room above the L button to put a second Z button, and they just didn't want to for no discernible reason. That also then made certain ports of games to the GameCube frustrating because you are missing a button and they have to contend with that in some way. And it is also lacking true analog triggers. It only has the 2-stage triggers, which for some games, like, say, Super Mario Sunshine, is used for gameplay functionality to have a clear stage on the button. But again, even for most games, like Nintendo games didn't really use that. Certainly, like, third-party games never used that. And there are games like racing games that were shit on the GameCube because you didn't have an analog control for your brakes and for your acceleration. And so it is a controller that works really well in a very narrow margin, almost exclusively Smash Brothers. And for the large majority of other games ported to the GameCube, it, like, is a really notably inferior controller compared to its competition.
I think that is a fair assessment of the GameCube controller. Sound off in the comments, everyone who is angry. Wiimote.
Again, you can play great games on a less than great controller.
Yes,
that doesn't mean the games are bad. And you can have nostalgia for the controller, but I think there are clear places where the controller needed more work in its design.
Yes. I think we are probably going to disagree on this next one. The Wiimote.
Chuck it out. Get rid of it. I hate it. I despise it. I never have ever wanted to play a game on the Wiimote. It has always made every game I played on it feel worse.
I love the Wiimote. It would be on my top 10. I genuinely like the Wiimote. I like the nunchuck. I enjoy playing games like that. I recently played Resident Evil 4 for our Resident Evil 4 episode that way, and I was reminded, man, this slaps. I love it. I think it's a fun controller in the hand. It's a big, bulky remote. You point at the screen. It's got the buttons. It's got a big A button, and it's got a big B button under your finger, and it feels like you're doing awesome light gun shit. It's my favorite way to play the Metroid Prime trilogy, which are some of my favorite games of all time. I like that you can turn the controller and do other things with it. You could turn it into a fucking wheel if you wanted. I think the Wiimote slapped. I love it.
Do you remember playing Mario Kart with that thing as a wheel? Do you remember how that went for you?
I did okay, but I've never been that good at Mario Kart, so...
Well, maybe now we know why, because you learned how to play it with your fucking Wiimote controller.
I learned to play it with the GameCube, thank you very much, but I did insist on playing it with the Wiimote. We had like 4 of those fucking racing wheels. I don't remember why, but we did use it a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Wii controller is a terrible controller. And this is not me saying that I think that like a controller that uses motion input or that a controller that like is like a light gun is inherently bad. I think that this is a bad one of those. It functioned poorly. It had terrible responsiveness. It constantly felt like it lost tracking. It was like every time you fucking booted up that fucking thing and you had to be like, oh, I gotta navigate the fucking menu with this stupid fucking pointer. It's just like it made everything laborious about accessing that console, because most games on the Wii were designed effectively to be used by a traditional controller, and then they had to shove this like motion control and pointer stuff on top of it. And it just made most games an absolute fucking nightmare. There's a reason why, after I got my Wii, I used it to play a little bit of Twilight Princess, I played a little bit of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and then I basically never used it again. Because it's like, other than occasionally to bring it out because I had it hooked up and I didn't have my GameCube hooked up, and I just put my GameCube controller in, and I played like fucking Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2, but just with a GameCube controller. Because I think it's like there's a kind of like the GameCube, maybe. It has a very narrow window of games that is effective for, which are light gun games. I will concede it is a light gun controller. For light gun games, it probably worked well. I didn't really play many light gun games with it. And so if I'm going to play a light gun game, I want my controller to be a gun. That's just my standard, you know? It's just I'm not going to play a light gun game with a remote control. I'm not a baby. So, yeah, I think it's terrible. I hate it. That's the conclusion. I hate it.
I still like it. I still enjoyed it. I enjoyed it for Mario Galaxy. I enjoyed doing the little waggle. I enjoy the Wiimote nunchuck.
How did you enjoy doing the waggle rather than just pressing a button to make the thing do the fucking thing? Like, did you play Twilight Princess with this thing?
It's kinetic. It's good. No, I never did. No.
Okay, maybe this partially explains it. That you had to waggle that thing in order to swing the sword, but all you did was you waggled it, and then it on the game side, it just inputted that as you have pressed a button. It's like, this is not an analog input device. This is, it is an analog input device, but you're taking this analog input device and translating it into a digital input. And that was so much of my experience playing games on the Wii, was you have taken an analog thing and are using it as a means to input a digital input, meaning analog, meaning you have like a wide range of movement and options that the control can enter into, like an analog stick, but a digital input is just, did you do it or not? Is it a 0 or a 1? And it's like, that is terrible fucking design. And when a small, narrow margin of games take advantage of your like light gun style reticle on screen as an analog input, if you have a small number of games that do that, but the majority of your games just don't and are designed for a traditional controller, and they are like being shoved into the format of the Wiimote, it made most games on that console, I think, a fucking nightmare to play.
By your own admission, though, you didn't play it much, so, you know.
Well, there's a reason why, because I had a terrible time with them.
Okay, but I'm saying I have good examples, and you just don't want to listen to them. Yes, there are absolutely examples. You have named them fulsomely here of the cases where it worked poorly. There are also cases where it works transcendently well, Metroid Prime being the main one. Amazing. If they don't figure out a way to do that in the eventual inevitable Switch port, I will be sad, but I will always have my Wii sitting right there, because I like my Wii. I like my Wiimote. Tell me in the comments if you are Team Jonathan or Team Sean on this one, and we'll figure out who wins. But for now, I think we will not include the Wiimote on this list, because it is a collective list, and you are very angry about it, so I will cut it off for now, and I'll be sad.
Thank you.
Next up is the Wii U. I haven't even bothered to write down Wii U gamepad. It's not on here. That's the worst. that is worse than the fucking Wiimote or anything else they've ever done.
I enjoyed playing Breath of the Wild on that thing better than I did playing Twilight Princess with the Wiimote. I don't know how much that says about the games or how much it says about the controller interfaces, but that's my only experience with the Wii U was playing Breath of the Wild when I borrowed your Wii U to play that game. That is it. That is the only thing I can say to it.
I have an extra layer of hatred towards the gamepad in that you had to interface with it for everything, even if you were booting up the Wii U to play a normal Wii U controller game or to go into Wiimote and play with your Wiimote. You had to go through the gamepad. It was a fucking like prison shackle on that system, and that is something I hate about it. Either way, it's not on the list. We can agree.
Yes, yeah.
But then there are two recent controllers Nintendo has made called their Pro controllers. That's the Wii U had a Pro controller, the Switch has a Pro controller. Not going to include both. I will argue, you don't have much experience with either of these, I assume, right?
No. I don't think I've ever touched a Switch Pro controller. I've played a little bit with the Wii U one.
Some people really love the Switch Pro controller, and I do get it. Ergonomically, the Switch Pro controller is an excellent controller that feels really, really good in the hands. In some ways, I prefer it to the design of either the Xbox or the DualSense, just in its ergonomics. It has one of the worst D-pads I've ever felt, though, and the problem with that is Nintendo has a lot of games I want to play with the D-pad. Like more than Xbox has had iffy D-pads in the past, but also who gave a shit? Like the 360, you didn't play a lot of games with the D-pads, you know? Yeah. If Nintendo has a controller with a bad D-pad, that's disastrous. The Switch Pro controller's D-pad is on a weird, like, fucking indent in the controller, which makes it impossible to hit one direction at a time if you're hitting right or up. And so that's not going on a top 10 for me because it's bad and makes it worse. And the problem is the Wii U Pro controller is sitting right there. All the same buttons, similar ergonomics, great D-pad. One of my favorite D-pads. It's just the good classic Nintendo D-pad updated. Yeah. It's a really good one. It also has the sticks more in the layout that you and I like. I know we're kind of on an island on this, but the sticks being on a parallel rather than alternate, offset. Like offset like Xbox. And I will go to bat. Wii U Pro controller, I think is still I think the SNES controller is the best if you are factoring in history. I think for modern games, I think the Wii U Pro controller might be Nintendo's best controller. It's underrated. It also had the most lunatic battery life in the history of video game controllers, like 150 hours. You never, ever had to charge that thing. It was amazing.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with it sticking. Again, I don't have much experience with it, but the experience I had was positive. I remember. I remember thinking it was a good controller.
So I'm putting that in the Pro Controller spot. I'm taking Switch Pro Controller off the list, which just leaves for Nintendo the Joy-Con to talk about. I would consider the Joy-Con for contention. I think I like the Joy-Con a lot. I think they are obviously, if you were sitting down on the couch and playing an in-depth, like first-person shooter or something that needed a lot of control, it's not for you. But that's also not what it is made for. I think as a pair of fully featured on-the-go controllers, they're amazing, and I think the fact that you can play them and it's just a great portable console experience, but then you can take them off and just use them as your normal controllers. This is also a reason why I like the Wiimote. I like the thing where you just have half a controller in each hand and you're not bound to one in the middle. That can be a fun, relaxing way to play a video game. Especially because the split D-pad on the Joy-Con has its own set of issues, like particularly for a fighting game or something. I still prefer it for most cases where you would use a D-pad to the Switch Pro controller. So the controller I use most on my Switch, which is my most used console, is just the Joy-Con. Still is. I still like them. There's certain things that they don't do perfectly, but they're also, I think you have to accept them for what they are. I think the thing that holds them back is the drift issue that has led to some quality control stuff, and then they still have iffy wireless connection every so often. That has mostly been fixed, but I still experience it from now and then. And so I would put it beneath these other Nintendo controllers for that reason, but I would consider it for contention.
I don't have a lot of personal experience with the Joy-Cons. I've only ever used them a few times. And I don't love the feel of it, I think it is, for me personally, it would not ever be my number one way to play a game. but there's a clear reason why it's like that. It's not the N64 controller where you just look at it as like this is madness for no good reason. Like the Joy-Cons are doing something super complicated. They are a controller that is attached to a screen that you can remove, that you can use both as independent controllers for some games in and of themselves. They've got little weird buttons on the top and stuff like that you can use. So you can play like co-op games and stuff like that and have each person have one Joy-Con. You can play them with like separately in each hand. You can put them in a little dock and play them together. They are very modular because they are for a console that is in itself modular in its experience as both a portable and home experience that also strongly emphasizes lots of like local co-op type stuff. So I think when you take that into account, yes, it has like its quality issues. It's got like the weird D-pad thing, which like for that you can split it out. It needs to be that way, but it does mean if you're playing it on your own, it might be a little bit of an issue. So it has its issues, but like what it is doing is really cool and innovative, and it clearly like serves such a wide use case for this complex console that I think it absolutely should be on the list.
Yes, good. Well, then I totally agree on that, and I think, there are, I think it's also just important to, put the history of portable consoles into contention here. Like, I loved the PS Vita. If we do our D-pads thing later on, y'all know what the best D-pad ever is, right?
Yes.
But also, do you remember the fucking sticks on the Vita? They're terrible. They're almost unusable. They were like, are the sticks on the Joy-Con as good as the sticks on an Xbox controller? No, but you shouldn't be comparing them to an Xbox controller. Compare them to like its immediate predecessor, which is something like the Vita or the Circle Pad on the 3DS. Like, they're very impressive in that regard. And of course, I see all the time online, there are different companies like PowerA and not Mad Catz doesn't exist anymore, but the Mad Catz-esque people of the world who make all their like big crazy Switch Joy-Con replacements that you put on there. I don't get that. Like, if I want to play it with a big-ass controller, I'll put it in the TV and use the Pro Controller. Like, it's so weird to me. And people say the Steam Deck, oh, so much better than the Switch because it's got these big controls. Have you seen a Steam Deck in person yet, Sean?
No.
I have. My friend has one. It's enormous. It's a ludicrously large piece of tech. I would not call it particularly portable. I don't think it's a leave-the-house portable thing. It's cool, but, like, I hope people understand that the Joy-Con is small because Nintendo wanted it to be a certain thing, not a massive size of a fucking, keyboard or something. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So those are our 4 Nintendo controllers in contention for the list. We have Super NES, GameCube, Wii U Pro, and Joy-Con. Let's talk about PlayStation. I think this discussion is a lot simpler. DualSense is going on the list.
Yes.
The PS5.
Yeah.
I think DualShock 4 doesn't need to because the DualSense is going on the list. Is that fair?
I think we shouldn't cut it yet because we don't know how many controllers we will have at the end of this conversation. So I would agree with you in principle, other than like, I don't know how many controllers we're going to have on the list.
Okay, let's back up then. PlayStation, I did not list in my little list here the original PlayStation controller without sticks. Do you want to stand up for that for any reason?
No, I mean, obviously, like, it was a good controller for its little time where, like, we didn't know how controllers are going to go, but obviously the DualShock is just a very straightforward improvement to that original PlayStation controller. So there would be no reason to put it on the list over the DualShock variant.
What's so funny is that, and this is still true about the PlayStation controller, is the original PlayStation controller is just a Super NES controller with handles. That's literally what it is. It's the same shape, it's the same button placements, all of that, but you have put handles on it. Then the DualShock is that, but with sticks in it, and then it refines over time. DualShock 1 through 3 are essentially the same controller. Is there one of those 3 that would stand out as the one to think about?
I would say the DualShock 2 would be the best of those. It had, like, I mean, obviously, like, it's basically the same thing as the DualShock 1 and DualShock 3. It has the one additional functionality of it did have pressure-sensitive analog buttons. Almost nothing ever used them, but a couple of games did. Like, Metal Gear Solid 2 uses it. Metal Gear Solid 3 also uses it. So there's, like, there's a few games that use that, and, like, I haven't played with a DualShock 2 in a long time, so I don't know how the build quality would feel to me now. At the time, I remember them feeling nice. versus the DualShock 3. And again, I don't know if like I actually had them side by side. I bet that it wouldn't feel that different, or maybe the DualShock 3's build quality would feel better. But relative to the competition like the Xbox 360 controller, the DualShock 3's build quality felt really cheap and bad. Whereas the DualShock 2, relative to the GameCube controller and the original Xbox, felt totally fine and like high quality. And so I remember feeling like that controller never felt like it was behind, whereas the DualShock 3 always felt like it was kind of behind its competition.
Yes. I think that's true. I think the way I would describe it with DualShock 2 versus 3 is, one, the DualShock 3 had one very obvious downgrade, which is that it turned the L2 and R2 into semi but not full triggers. Because you remember on the DualShock 2, they're enclosed in the plastic, so they're buttons. Yeah. They have analog pressure, but they're buttons. The 3 made them triggers, but they weren't trigger-shaped, so your finger just slid off the back, and you would have to like buy a fucking attachment and put it on there if you wanted to use them as triggers. So that was a clear downgrade from the DualShock 2. DualShock 3 is wireless. That was its upgrade. It also had the 6-axis stuff that nothing ever used. So not really relevant to this discussion. And I think you're right about build quality. I think the actual answer, Sean, is that they're roughly equivalent in build quality. It's just that a wired item, whether it be a mouse or a keyboard or a controller, you expect to feel less substantial than a wireless variant. A wireless variant will usually have more heft to it, and the DualShock 3 didn't. It felt very cheap, and because it didn't have a wire coming out of it, it threw that into sharp relief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. DualShock 4 was an obvious improvement in every way.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great controller. It's like the only thing is that the DualSense is such a like clearly better version of that controller that like I think is the thing that we will see how many things we have at the end of this.
Yeah. But the DualShock 4, I think, it had an attention to detail. I love that it brought the 4 face buttons into symmetry for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, the Super NES intentionally had them on a certain kind of plane. The PlayStation was basically based off of that. And then up and through the DualShock 3, it still had them off-axis a little bit, and then the DualShock 4 put them in perfect symmetry. Stuff like that I love. I also still like the look of the DualShock 4 more than the DualSense. I think it looked better in color. I like that the buttons still had the colors on the shapes and stuff like that. I wish there was a variant of the DualSense that embraced the PlayStation colors. I missed that. For functionality, the DualSense is better, no question. But yeah.
Yeah, but like the DualShock 4, it gave it proper triggers that felt really nice. Yes. The touchpad, which is very underused, is a good addition to the controller. Like, in the cases in which it was used, it can be used well for the first-party stuff. It's one of the things I always wish that people took more advantage of that. There were games that actually sometimes used the gyroscope now, like Gravity Rush and stuff like that. So it's like a still very underused feature, but a nice little addition. I would say the number one, this is like an ill-sung feature of this, or a not often sung feature of this controller, but is one that is phenomenal, and I think is like, well, like, I guess there's actually two things about the DualSense, or DualShock 4 that are huge kind of industry-changing things in the controller for me. One is more obvious, which is the share button, which was a huge addition.
Yes.
But I will always love that they put the fucking headphone jack on the bottom of the controller.
It's amazing.
It was such a smart, cool choice. That just is so useful so much of the time, whether it's for headsets or it's just to be able to play a game with just plug your fucking headphones in there if you don't want to bother anybody else around you, that kind of stuff. Such a great little feature. Obviously, all this stuff is stuff that's carried forward into the DualSense, but the DualShock 4 really sort of pushed, I think, the envelope more than you would think, particularly compared to like the Xbox controller at the time, which didn't really do anything different.
I think if you're talking pure innovation, the DualShock 4 is the best controller Sony's ever made. If you're talking overall refinement, it's the DualSense. But the 4, and the DualSense brings its own stuff to the table. I think the history is still unwritten on how much that will be.
Yeah, it's a new controller. Yeah.
Right. But the DualShock 4, you're talking about the headphone jack being, it isn't just influential there. I have a Roku remote for my Roku TV that has a headphone jack in it that will pipe anything through the TV through the remote. That is fucking amazing, and I know that wouldn't exist if it weren't for the DualShock 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, great controller. We'll keep 2, 4, and DualSense in contention, and we'll come back to it. Now we get to the Xbox, Sean, which is a complicated one, because the Xbox sort of has its one shape, but it has its one shape that's been played with in different ways. So the original Xbox had the Duke and then the smaller variant. I don't think I've ever.
S.
Okay, Xbox Controller S. There's so many S's in the Xbox world, almost as many as there are X's. I never played with the smaller one. I only ever played with the Duke. The Duke, also it should be said, is a fairly clear copy of the Dreamcast controller, which we will get to later. So I don't know if I would put it on the list either way. I feel like if I were going to give one of that slot, it should go to the Dreamcast. But you played with the Xbox more, so do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, if you were going to give it to one of the two original Xbox controllers, the Controller S is a clearly better controller. It moved the white and black buttons. Like, the white and black buttons are bad wherever they are on the controller. They were a bad choice. They shouldn't have done it. But they used to be above the four face buttons and, like, shoved into the corner, making them really hard to access, particularly if you don't have very big hands. And the S moved it down like to the bottom right of the controller under the face buttons, which is a little bit easier to get to. And they're like opposite sides of where the start and back buttons were. So it's like there's a symmetry there that worked well. It just was like a nicer fit. The prongs were more like sort of easy to hold on to, stuff like that. So it's like, you know, for its time, particularly for a console that really heavily emphasized first and third person shooters, it was a great controller because they had the best analog sticks out of those three. And that was also true of the Duke. The Duke's controller analog sticks were also quite good. The Duke was just sort of unwieldy. It's got like that weird little kind of like belly almost, like that sort of protrudes down between the two prongs. It's just like a big beast of a controller. So I have a huge amount of fondness for the original Xbox controller. It is not a controller that I would like readily go back to or try to use actively outside of loading a game onto my original Xbox, like say Enter the Matrix or a game like that maybe I own that we haven't done a podcast on yet. But yeah, I don't want to cut it yet. But I would keep the controller S would be the one I would say let's not cut it yet, but it will probably end up being cut from one of some of these other controllers.
And, you know, the Duke and the Controller S, its real legacy is it became the 360 controller. Because if you look at it, it's very clear how that evolved into the 360 controller. The D-pad is the same. The stick placements are the same. The way the kind of legs jut out, all of that just kind of became the 360 controller. So let's talk about it. 360 controller, obvious contender for the list. It's one of the most important in the history of gaming. It's the controller that popularized controller gaming on PC. Like, it was the universal controller for years and years and years. I think it's been refined into a better form if you go to the most modern Xbox controller, but it was a banger. You can't deny it. It's very great and important controller.
Yeah, the 360 feels like it is like the birth of the modern controller, right? Like it pulls in the bumpers from the PlayStation controller, but combines it with the nice analog triggers that the original Xbox controller had. It's got the nice sticks on it. You know, that now if you go back to it, feel kind of cheap compared to our modern analog sticks, but at the time felt really, really good. It's got your like home button thing, which is a new concept at the time because consoles didn't have like home OS level features. I mean, they did, but you had to like boot the console up without a game in it and shit like that to access the memory, you know? Whereas this, you're going back to the Blades interface and all of that. It's got your force face buttons. Though obviously the one like detractor to the controller is that the analog stick or the D-pad is bad, right? It is a weird sort of like disc that is very difficult to get clear inputs on. Like, it works fine for like general vague D-pad-y stuff, but any game that really needs to use the D-pad a lot, particularly a fighting game, that D-pad was not very good at all. That's like its clear big detracting point. But other than that, the rest of the controller is really good. It was super compatible with PCs in a way that was revolutionary, you know, like just because everything registered it to the point where it would, you know, games would put the button icons into the game and stuff like that, which was new at the time. And so, yeah, it is a great controller, you know, a changing moment in the history of video game controllers, the Xbox 360.
Also, just like, this is not something that's super relevant anymore in controllers, but this is my favorite version ever of the identify which of the 4 controllers you have, because of it had a green ring around the Xbox button. The Xbox button itself, which is just so cool. Like, the modern Xbox buttons are just sort of a flat Xbox logo. This one was a big rounded thing where you could feel the molded plastic, and there's a green ring, and each of those segments is one of the different players, and it would fill up depending on which controller you had. It was a cool controller. Also, something that has been carried forward through the most modern Xbox controller, and I guess this actually extends all the way back to the Duke, but I've always liked this about Xbox controllers, is the buttons are concave plastic. They're very tactile, they're very clicky, they have a lot of good travel. I've always preferred those to the mushier PlayStation buttons. And it's just something, and they were, on the 360 they were colorful. I like it.
Yeah, it is a great classic controller.
Yep. So that's obviously on the list. I think we can cut the Xbox One controller very easily because the Series controller just is that with some improvements. Particularly the Xbox Series controller adds a share button, and it also has, I think, one of the best D-pads that has ever been made. The Series controller's D-pad is like a kind of mix of a traditional Nintendo D-pad and what the 360 was kind of trying to go for, in that it has sort of a disc around it, but it's under it. And I don't know how much you've used one of these, Sean, but I've played a lot of games through with the Series S controller using the D-pad because I just love it. And it's really tactile for 4-direction games, but you can also shift from, down to right or right to up or something really easily because of that extra little ridge under it. It's very clicky. It's nice and raised off the controller. It's a fantastic D-pad. It's my favorite easily on any modern controller, and I'm super impressed by it. And that refinement, I think, this is the best controller Xbox has made, the one that ships with the Series consoles. I put the Xbox Elite controller on here. I don't actually want to consider it because that's a special extra thing. I think it's better to just look at the controllers that shipped with the consoles.
Yeah.
But you can talk about that. That is obviously a very nice controller, but it's $150. To be honest, though, in some ways, I prefer the Xbox Series controller because of that D-pad. And I have the Elite controller. I do use it. I love the general weight, and like the sticks are fucking, titanium, stainless steel. They feel really good in the hand. All of that. It has the back. I don't know what's called, the back buttons, the paddles. I love that. The thing I've never liked about it is it has this like molded grip around the grips that just gets slippery for me, and I actually like the texture of a normal Xbox controller even more, which also has a little bit of grip, but it's a plastic grip, so it doesn't get like slidey in your hands when you play for a long time. So the Xbox Series controller would be a contender for near the top of the list for me. I think it's great.
Yeah, I would agree. Like, I think for me, the Xbox, the original version of the Xbox One controller is a very easy cut because that like, I think people forget maybe now that there was a revision partway through the Xbox One's lifespan that fixed some of the stuff that original controller had, like the bumpers were hard to press, and the stuff like that. So that original Xbox One controller was not amazing, particularly when you compared it to the DualShock 4, because it didn't have some of the stuff like the share button and the headphone jack, which they later put into the revision and stuff like that. Whereas the Series controller has parity on all those kinds of features. It's got the rumble triggers, which is a very take it or leave it kind of thing, but it's nice to have. Not a lot of things use it that much. But the bumpers are very easy to press, so it fixed that issue. Like, it feels pretty decent in the hand. It's just got all the function you want. And then I agree, like the D-pad is really good. Of the modern controllers, I mean, basically of everything other than a couple of like handheld controllers, I think it has the best D-pad of any standard controller I've ever used. So
it has the best. I think you're right. It has the best D-pad on any controller. I would say my favorite one ever is the Vita. I would give a shout out to the Nintendo or the Game Boy Advance SP. There's a lot that we could talk about. But yeah, on an actual gamepad, it's the best. The current generation of controllers, no consoles have shipped with better controllers. That I think is just very clear.
Yes.
So. Yeah. Sega controllers. You know more of Sega consoles than I do. The one I have the most first-person experience with is the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast controller should be thought about. It is a very influential controller in a lot of ways. When you go back and look at it, it's a fucking weird controller. It's got a big empty gap in the front for the VMU, which is the coolest thing about the Dreamcast. It's got one stick. It doesn't have two sticks. It has one. It has a D-pad. It has your 4 face buttons, the colors and everything of which Xbox just kind of stole that.
Yep.
The general look is very much like the Duke. It's got your triggers on the back. It had the wire coming out of the bottom, which I think was kind of cool. Good controller, obviously. I think it certainly, the Xbox controller, the lineage is clear that this one was influential to that. I don't know if I think on its own it's one of the best controllers ever made, but in a historical sense, important.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one where I wouldn't really go back to it other than for like the nostalgia of it. I mean, obviously there are lots of like features like dual analog sticks. It doesn't have like all the buttons you'd want to have. That it only has like the 2 triggers. It doesn't have the bumpers. Like it has missing features that make it so that, I mean, obviously games designed on that console, fine. Like they didn't necessarily need it. But, I mean, it was not a very future-proofed controller, I guess, for a console that was only around for a little bit over a year. But I think the big thing about it is the VMU. Like, what a awesome concept. Here's, like, a little memory card, like, Game Boy thingy that you can play your, like, Tamagotchi-style little Chow game and all that kind of stuff in Sonic Adventure. Like, a crazy idea. Nothing has ever done it. I think for good reason. It, like, makes your controller expensive and all that kind of stuff. Like, it is, like... It is a feature that is cooler in idea than it generally, I think, was actually in practice. But what a fucking cool idea it is. Cool enough that I think it gets to stay around, at least for now. We'll see if it makes the list. But I would not cut the Dreamcast yet.
There was nothing like playing Sonic Adventure and looking down and seeing your Chow or something. Resident Evil games showed you your ammo and whatnot. It was a really cool idea, and I do think, like... it used in substantive ways in some cases, and nothing has ever replicated that, so it remains unique.
Absolutely.
Tell us about the Sega Genesis controller.
Okay, so if we're putting a Sega Genesis controller in contention, it would be the 6-button controller, which is one of the variants. It originally launched with a 3-button controller. Sega Genesis is a fucking great controller. It obviously didn't have any of the bumper stuff, so like in that way it is older fashioned. Obviously it came out pre Super Nintendo, so the Super Nintendo kind of pushed forward with that bumper design. But if you particularly were playing stuff like some of the fighting games like a Mortal Kombat or something like that, or from at my household we played a lot of Primal Rage because that's what we owned, that 6-button controller was really essential because it gave you the full kinds of buttons you'd have access to at the arcade. The buttons felt very nice, and it had a cool D-pad design where it had an 8-directional D-pad, effectively. So it is a little bit like, I think, conceptually kind of the Xbox 360 D-pad, but a lot clickier than that one. It didn't feel as much like you were on a disc, even though the function of it was a disc fundamentally, but it did make it so that if you're playing those games that required rolling inputs, like a fighting game or something, it had like a nice sort of roll and give to it that I've always really, really loved that D-pad on the Sega Genesis. I mean, it's a fundamentally pretty simple controller in its design, particularly if you're doing the 3-button. It's just, all it is face buttons, 3 or 6, depending on your controller. It has a start button, and it has an 8-directional D-pad. And that's it. But it is a good feel in the hand, a good basic controller. You really couldn't ask for much more. Back in the 90s, if you were playing, say, Sonic the Hedgehog, the controller did everything you needed it to do.
Absolutely. I have very little experience with it personally, other than I've held it at your house, that kind of thing. I never owned a Dreamcast, but you can see, one thing I love about it is it's had a lineage in certain places, but it is largely its own thing that has not been replicated other than in parts. So it remains very unique and very cool to look at, and obviously for the games that made use of it, made brilliant use of it.
Yeah, and it's just like it is a good look. It looks slick. That nice black design. It looks way cooler than the Super Nintendo controller, which looks a little bit like a toy to me. Whereas like the Sega one has like this it's got the Sega-tude to it, right? It's got this very sleek aesthetic that I've always really liked. if you're going by aesthetics as well. That is one of the big things that I think like the Xbox controller also carried forward, because I think the original Xbox controller has that like cool, sleek black look that it looks very nice.
Absolutely. Any other Sega systems and their controllers we should think about here?
I've never used the Sega Saturn controller, so I don't know. The Sega Saturn controller always looks super weird. So
Yes.
I cannot speak to that one at all. Maybe there's probably somebody who's like, you maniacs, how could you not put the Sega Saturn controller or the 3D pad, the Sega Saturn 3D controller with the analog stick? How? I've never used one. So
The Sega Saturn controller looks like you're halfway to a fighting pad, and the Sega Saturn 3D controller looks like a Dreamcast controller, but made into a circle, and it's just a big circle that you hold. It's very weird.
The Sega Saturn controller looks like it's like a like Mad Catz Sega Genesis controller to me. Like it just like it looks very extra in the way that like some of those third-party controllers were. But again, I haven't used it, so.
Are there any other controllers that I have forgotten about in making this list? We've hit Nintendo, we've hit Sega, we've hit PlayStation, we've hit Xbox. What else?
Well, I mean, there is one Xbox controller, Jonathan, that I think is really important that we've missed here. Which
I know what you're
is
going to say.
you. It's you, Jonathan. You're the controller. Why do you need to put something in your hand? Why do you need to press some buttons? What if you were the button, Jonathan? What if you just pressed yourself? Let me introduce you to the Xbox Kinect, the revolution in video game controlling. It's going to come back any second now. We will realize our folly. And know that we fucked up. We don't need something in our hands. We just need the concept of a controller, and that is enough.
So I know we said earlier that the N64 controller is the worst of the ones we've used. If you are considering me or you as the controller via the Kinect is the worst controller ever. The Kinect is the worst piece of shit that has ever been dropped. Like, there are worse things made by, like, Mad Catz, but in terms of, like, a first part... Like, I know you don't like the Wiimote, Sean. So much better than the Kinect. Fucking Wii U gamepad, so much better than the Kinect. The Kinect was a goddamn scam.
Yes.
Terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Kinect was like the nightmare endpoint of what the Wiimote introduced into our lives. It was just like, so like Sony went like, oh, let's do the Move controller and then let's just not do anything with it. But let's like let's satisfy this like weird demand we have right now for these like TV remote looking controllers. And then Xbox was like, you know what, fuck that. Like, let's just stick a camera on our goddamn thing and let's not give you anything meaningful to track. Let's just track you somehow. Let's do our best. And I'm sure they did their best, but I will never forgive them for the Kinect that they never had the feature where you could like take your real world skateboard and scan it into the game, like in this early there was like, here's a stick and now it's a sword in my game. God, it's like some of those early ads, like truly, like if you're talking about a scam, straight up, like fucking, that's some true false advertising shit. If you look at those early Kinect ads, so much of that was like, not only was that never possible, or like never was added to the Kinect's features, even when they did a generational shift. Obviously, it was something that they would never be able to do. The technology is nowhere near close to this like fucking Star Trek hologram bullshit that they were sort of like trying to pitch you.
Utter insanity. I'm taking you / the Kinect / me off the list. That was bad. Do we need to consider the PlayStation Move? I've never really used it.
I've touched one, I think, once. No, I don't think we need to. If the Wiimote doesn't make it, the fucking PlayStation Move doesn't make it. Like, I think one area where I do want to note, like, just mention that because we have not touched any of this kind of controller, we just can't speak to it, are the VR controllers. Right? Like, that would be a clear area where, if you wanted to see the Wiimote's legacy and what it did lead to and continues to lead to sort of in the video game controller area, it is in like your weird host of VR controllers, feels like the end point of the Wii U or the Wiimote and some of that concept. But since neither of us own a VR headset, neither of us have used any of those controllers, we cannot speak to that. I mean, they might very well, some of those controllers might very well be in contention. Some of them seem very good. They are all very expensive, but we haven't used them.
Exactly. Atari is before our time, and I don't think Atari would make it onto this kind of list anyway, but worth mentioning, I think the original Atari 2600 controller for its time, really cool. Just a joystick and a button, and it knew what it was doing, and it was fun to use. Then there's all the like post Atari 2600 controllers that became like big remotes with number pads and looked awful and unusable. And the NES, I know we took the NES off early. The NES saved the fucking industry by having a sane controller that you could iterate on. The game controllers were in a dire period before the NES rode in.
Yes, yeah. Obviously, like any of the controllers of the 1970s is well before our time to comment on specifically. Yes. But yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously the Atari 2600 controller is a classic and it's cool. And I liked that era where you had controllers that were basically an Atari controller that you just plugged into your TV, and they had like Dig Dug and like Galaxian and a bunch of old arcade games on them. Like that's the only context in which I've really used that kind of controller, which isn't the exact same thing. And it's a cool controller, but obviously very limited and kind of outside our area.
Yes. All right. Well, with that in mind, we have our contenders. We have 4, 8, 12, 13 on the list. Let's figure out how we are going to rank these, Sean. Where would you want to start? Do you want to start near the top, make an argument for what should be at or near the top?
I mean, I would personally put the DualSense at the top. That's my favorite controller that is on the market. I think for me, the 1 and 2 would be the DualSense and the Xbox Series controller. I think those are, if you're particularly just taking into account, like, what is the controller, if I were to play a game right now and could play that game with any controller, what controller would I pick? I would pick the DualSense, or I would pick the Xbox Series controller. So those, if that's like the way we're ranking the list more than like the historical impact, those would be my number 1 and 2.
Those would be near the top for me. I would add, it doesn't necessarily need to be a number 1, but I think it should be in the top 3, is the Super NES controller. Historical impact is obvious, but I will add, I still enjoy playing on a Super NES controller. Now, I don't literally like have one in my room attached to a Super NES, but like I have an 8-bit do replica. It's a Super NES controller. They've added, the sticks onto it, and they've added an extra set of shoulder buttons. I still love this thing. It's my travel controller. It's what I bring with me when I travel, which I have to do a fair amount these days, going back and forth from Iowa to Colorado. And like when I play Genshin Impact, not on my PlayStation, this is the controller I'm using for it. I am still kind of shocked by just what a fundamentally good shape the Super NES controller had. It fits in the hands really well. It fits differently than controllers now because it doesn't have the handles. But I think you'd be shocked if you went back to it, that it just conforms to the hands. Everything is right there. Your top fingers just layer right onto those shoulder buttons. Your fingers go right into place. Big, meaty D-pad. Big, fun, buttons, face buttons. You got your start and select in the middle. It's just like there's a reason why every controller is on some level inspired by the Super NES controller, and I think it still to some degree stands the test of time. If I'm playing an actual SNES game, of course I'm plugging one of my replicas or something. It's there's a reason why it has had the impact it's had, and I would, for those reasons, I'm not saying it has to be number 1 above these other ones, but I would put it very near the top.
I'm fine with it being near the top. I don't have anywhere near that like relationship with it. Like I would not personally buy a replica Super Nintendo controller. I would not like use it really for anything. I have way more nostalgia personally for the Genesis controllers, were I to play in, I mean, obviously I wouldn't play a Super Nintendo game with a Genesis controller, but were I to go back to games of that period, my heart lies with the Genesis, so that's what I would go to personally. But obviously the Super Nintendo controller is a more influential design. It's the thing that led to the bumper buttons, and like is the clear like step to what gets us to put some analog sticks on that thing and some prongs, and then you're there to our modern controller design. So
yeah.
So,
but let's call that tier 1. Let's call those the top 3, and so we'll come back and rank those in a little bit.
Okay.
Let's call that tier 1. What would go a tier below that for you? Where would we go next?
Xbox 360 probably.
Yeah. Xbox 360, would you argue for the Genesis here? Would you argue for any of the others?
I mean, for me personally, it would then be the Genesis, yes. If I were making this list purely on my own, if I were making my list purely on my own, the 360 would be where the SNES is, and the Sega Genesis would be below that. But that's just me.
Yeah, but we're doing it together, so I'm putting it here. I think for other Nintendo controllers, I would maybe it's funny because the Wii U Pro controller is never going to be used again in any form, so I don't know where I would. But it is a good one. I'm wondering if the DualShock 2 or 4 should go in this next, or if they're a tier below that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think for me next, I would lean towards one of the PlayStation controllers or the Joy-Con. I think would be the next set that I would look at. I think, and again, I can't speak too much specifically to the Nintendo controllers. I think of what is left, the Joy-Con is the most impressive one to me because what that controller is asked to do.
I think that's true. I think having a tier that is the 360 and the Genesis, I like that, especially because the Genesis is just the most unique of these ones we have left. And then I think Joy-Con DualShock 4, I think that's good. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have 3 left from the collection here, which is DualShock 2, GameCube, Wii U Pro, Xbox Duke or Controller S, and the Sega Dreamcast. Of the ones that remain, I feel like Xbox is pretty well covered. I don't know if we need either of those. I don't know if we need the DualShock 2. I might stick with the 2 Nintendos and Sega.
I don't have a strong preference here. Like, I would lean towards doing, like, the Dreamcast, the GameCube controller, and either the DualShock 2 or the Controller S. But, like, again, I can't speak too much to the Wii U Pro. I think the reason why I don't lean towards the Wii U Pro controller is because we have a lot of controllers that have that same basic configuration already. So, like, I don't know if that controller is so good that it gets to power its way on this list, despite we have the Series, the DualSense, the 360, the DualShock 4 controller already. Is the Wii U Pro controller so good that it gets to fight its way on the list, despite all those other controllers?
Probably not. I will add, I think one cool thing about is that it's actually not exactly the shape of other ones. It is, if you look it up, it's shaped and in the hand like an Xbox 360 controller, but it has the parallel stick layout of the PlayStation, but the sticks are up on top, and then the D-pad is below with the face buttons, and then you've got your triggers. It's a weird shape. That D-pad was so good, but I think, the Series controller has eclipsed that for now. I'm fine leaving it off the list, because of course it has no historical impact. Barely anyone used it. So, which was the one you were saying you would lean to other than that?
Either DualShock 2 or the Controller S would be... I'm fine with either of those, honestly.
This is tough for me, because I have more experience with the DualShock 2. And I think the DualShock 2 for historical import, I feel like whatever historical import the Controller S has was absorbed into the 360.
Sure. And
maybe the DualShock 2 should be at the number 10 spot, just at the lowest of the list.
I would put it above the GameCube controller.
Okay, we'll have that debate in a minute then. But Are you okay with these as the 10 then, and we're leaving off Wii U Pro and the original Xbox pads?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
All right. Well, then there you go. We have our 10. Let's debate how we're going to rank these. Let's go to the top. I would be fine putting DualSense at number 1 and Xbox Series at number 2. It's kind of boring, but for a good reason.
Yeah, it's just like, I feel like it would be dishonest to do anything other than that, right? Like, it's just like, because really, of standard controllers, they are better than all the controllers that have come before them. Like, I just don't think there's any real way to argue against that point. I personally, of those two, lean towards the DualSense because I fucking love the haptics and the adaptive triggers. Like, not everything uses particularly adaptive triggers that much, but when they get used, it's super fucking cool. And I just like the weight and the feel of it. Like, it's what I have plugged into my PC. I have one of my spare DualSense controllers plugged in here. And it's what I've been using as a PC controller, and it plugs right in. It works, like, perfectly. I don't need to fiddle with it at all, so it has become kind of like my standard controller at this point. I think it's great.
Yeah, it's a very close number 1 and number 2 for me, I will say. I agree with you about those things on the DualSense. I prefer the D-pad, face buttons, and sticks on the Xbox, and that's no small thing. I really do prefer all of those. Those have always been things that feel fine, that feel good, but not necessarily the highest quality to me on the PlayStation controllers. I think the ergonomics of the DualSense I like the best. It just feels very good in the hand. Weight is great. I will also say DualSense has a rechargeable battery inside, and the Xbox still, bafflingly, in the year of our Lord 2022, has a battery compartment where you either have to buy the rechargeable battery pack or put in AA's yourself. That's inexcusable. That alone, I think, puts the DualSense at number one. It just makes it more usable in today's day and age. But I do want to say I think the series has some clear, things that it does even better. But that's why it's nice that we have both.
Yeah. One other thing about the DualSense, another undersung feature of that controller is I love that that you can hold down that one button to mute the audio of your thing. That is such a useful, in case, someone's coming over to come talk to you, and how many times have you had to phone is oh shit, I can't hear you, where's my remote to mute thing? You just having a mute button right on the controller. Awesome. I fucking love it. I use it so much.
Yeah. Other thing, I do think Xbox has better colors and things for their controllers. I wish the DualSense would get their colorway game better. But yes, I think where it counts, this is a very close 1 and 2, but I would put DualSense at number 1 as well. The DualSense feels just that little bit more premium in certain ways it's very impressive as something that's shipped with a console. It feels like, I think, in terms of controllers that ship with consoles, the pinnacle of that particular mountain. But Xbox isn't that far behind.
Yeah, and it gets a lot of points for me personally for having things that I've never seen another controller do before. Yes. That's the one thing that the series controllers lack. It is a great controller. It is the best controller Xbox has ever made, but it's not doing anything that other controllers haven't done. It's just doing those things in a nicer package,
Yeah. All right, I think 4 is Xbox 360.
Yeah.
And then we had Genesis at the next spot, and I think that falls in there fine. That's a fun top 5, I think. It's very... Yes. There's actually a lot of variation there. I like that we have both 16-bit consoles.
Yes. Yeah. I'm very happy so far that top 5.
Then we have Joy-Con versus DualShock 4. As the person who has copious experience with both of these, I will say DualShock 4. Joy-Con, what it's doing is very impressive. DualShock 4 was a more reliable controller. I think its innovations of things like the share button and the headphone jack are better than the modular innovations of the Joy-Con and more repeatable and long-lasting.
Yeah, I mean, the Joy-Con has a share button on it, It's the DualShock 4 is one of those things that it innovated in the space in the console, the controller space, that every controller after the DualShock 4 has a fucking share button. It's kind of hard to imagine a controller not having one. So, yeah, I think that gives it big points.
Yeah. All right, then we have the Dreamcast, the GameCube, and the DualShock 2. My least favorite of those is probably the Dreamcast.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's put that
in terms of I mean, particularly if I was thinking which one would I use, the Dreamcast is the Dreamcast is a historical novelty. It is not a controller I would ever actually go back to other than to mess with the VMU in some weird way.
I would put the GameCube above the DualShock 2, but I'm okay if you want to do it the other way.
I would put the DualShock 2 above the GameCube controller. I don't know. It's if you want to play Smash, Nintendo made a controller for you. If you want to play anything else, the DualShock 2 is better for every other video game that released on the GameCube other than Smash Brothers.
True. I think the one thing you could add, though, is that nobody's manufacturing new DualShock 2s anymore. The GameCube controller still gets sold and released, and I have them in my fucking drawer with my consoles for Smash sometimes still. I know it's for just one game, but it is still an active part of the video game community.
I mean, but that's they do make DualShock 2s. They're just called DualShock 3s, then 4s, then DualSenses, right? So it's you don't need to hold on to and repeatedly manufacture this one controller because it was only made for one video game. It is a controller that can work for all kinds of video games, and it works perfectly fine.
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yes.
I don't really care that much. I think this is a good top 10. Let's go through it here, Sean. From 10 to number 1. Our number 10 is the Sega Dreamcast controller.
Our number 9 is the GameCube controller.
Our number 8 is the DualShock 2 from the PlayStation 2.
Our number 7 is the Joy-Cons for the Nintendo Switch.
Our number 6 is the DualShock 4 for the PlayStation 4.
Our number 5 is the Sega Genesis 6-button controller.
Our number 4 is the Xbox 360 controller.
Our number 3 is the Super Nintendo controller.
Our number 2 is the Xbox Series controller, which I've seen referred to lately as the Xbox Core controller. Somehow that's even worse. It's just the Xbox Series controller.
Yes. And our number 1 is the Sony DualSense controller for the PlayStation 5.
This is interesting. I actually like that we have 2 for Xbox. We've got 3 for PlayStation. I think we've got 3 for Nintendo. We've got 2 for Sega. I actually like the spread of that. I think there's a good mix of history in here. I don't think there's recency bias in that what the number 1 and 2 are, but I think there's good reason for it. But in our top 5, we then also have older controllers that have stood the test of time. I think this is a good list.
Yes, I will stand by this list of 10 controllers and our rankings of them.
All right. Well, do you want to rank the top 5 D-pads with me?
Sure. Let's go ahead and let's just move the Vita to the top.
Okay.
So that's the number one.
I pulled out my Vita recently, Sean, and charged it up because I was thinking about playing something on it. And I was struck all over again. The Vita's D-pad is just... It's maybe my favorite single input that anyone's ever made for any kind of controller. I don't know what magic they used. It's just perfect. The thing that really baffles me is why the PS4 and 5 don't just use that bigger on theirs. Because the D-pads are fine on the DualShock 4 and DualSense. They're just nothing special, and I think they're lesser than some of the competition. But the Vita, they nailed it. Please bring that back. It's so good.
Yeah, I have more fun just spinning my finger around on the D-pad on the Vita during loading screens than I do having playing whole other video games sometimes. Like,
yes.
It is a purely satisfying tactile input that is like, if you have not played it on a Vita, it is really hard to describe how good it feels to just mess with, as well as obviously then when you're using it like actively, it's extremely functional. It does what it needs to do, but it also just feels good. And so yeah, it's easily my number 1. Like, it's kind of number 1 with a bullet, no contest. It's almost like, why even put other things on the list? Because the Vita's there. Like, do you need top 5 D-pads, or do you just need the PS Vita D-pad?
Well, I think we need it just to really show PS Vita is at the top of a fucking mountain. That's its legacy. Other ones I would consider here. Game Boy Advance SP. I don't know last time you used one of those, Sean. That D-pad fucking rocked. It has one, they put a nice little circle around it, so it's like layered in there a little bit. It just rolls through your hand really well, but it's also clicky and tactile. The size was perfect. The Game Boy went through a wide variety of D-pad types, but that one was always just the king. They never did it better on the 3DS or on the earlier Game Boys. Just perfect.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That would be my number 2, personally.
Xbox Series controller would be up there. I think Super NES would be up there. I think the Wii U Pro would be my other favorite Nintendo one. That one, again, if you've never used that one, and it's the exact... I should say, you actually don't need to say Wii U Pro, because it's the exact same D-pad that is also on the gamepad. It's a nice, big, fat, good D-pad. So I would put the Wii U one on there. That might be a good top 5. There's the question of, does WASD on the keyboard count as a D-pad?
No, those are 4 keys. It is not a pad.
Okay, good. Someone would have asked if I didn't. I had a couple others listed here, but I don't know if they would qualify. Do you have any others?
No, I mean, I can't speak to the Wii U one. I'll say, I've played on my new Nintendo 2DS XL, and I think that has a very good D-pad. I wouldn't put it above the SP or the Vita or the Series controller.
The Wii U
it's been so long since I used the Super Nintendo that I cannot remember how that D-pad feels relative to that. So
yeah, I think the Wii U one is the best one Nintendo has made so far, because it's basically what they had on the DS line, starting with the DS Lite, basically iterating up through what you have, which is the new Nintendo 2DS. And then the Wii U just took that, and it's a bigger, fatter version of it, and it just feels great. So that one I would actually have near the top. Super NES is actually hard because there's so many variants of it. It's a little stiffer. I would put it near the bottom if we were going to put it on there. Yeah, I wouldn't really consider the PS4 or 5. Those are fine, but I don't think they're exceptional.
No. I mean, I'd be happy putting the Sega Genesis one on there.
Sure.
I like it better than the Super Nintendo one, but I'm the Sega kid, so of course I would say that. So
I'm fine putting it on there because I think the Wii U is like the best version of the Super NES legacy, just brought up through time. So, yeah. I think these are the top 5. I think Genesis, Wii U, Xbox Series, SP, Vita are the top 5 in some order.
Yes. I mean, I'm perfectly happy with the order they're currently in. I mean,
actually like that.
The thing I care about is the PS Vita is number 1. That's the one I would fight for.
Then let's do that. Let's say number 1 PS Vita, number 2 SP, number 3 Xbox Series controller, number 4 Wii U, number 5 Sega Genesis. I could flip Game Boy and Xbox there, but other than that, I'm fine. I could not. I don't. Either way, I'm good.
Yeah, I would leave it as is, personally.
Yeah. Then let's do it. Our top 5 D-pads of all time. Sega Genesis at number 5.
Wii U at number 4.
Xbox Series at number 3.
Game Boy Advance SP at number 2.
And number 1, our beautiful boy, our Persona Master, the PS Vita.
May you long live PS Vita. Long live the king. Sleeping
Great.
on the misty Isle of Avalon. It shall return one day to rule over all video gamedom, the PS Vita.
It shall rise again to judge the living and the dead, D-pads of today.
Exactly.
Well, Sean, was this as torturous as you thought it would be?
No, I think we had an engaging intellectual conversation about the relative merits of video game controllers throughout history. I'm glad that the Wiimote isn't on the list. That's the thing that's most satisfying to me. I'm glad that I was able to get that kicked off this list, even though this is your birthday podcast. There are some things that will not be stood for, and that is one of them.
Do we need to start sunsetting this show now that we've hit this particular break glass in case of emergency topic? Because there was nothing more bottom of the barrel break glass in case of emergency than controllers and D-pads. We need to replenish the bottom of that barrel somehow.
I feel like I've got an Xbox copy of Enter the Matrix right over there. That to me that's in the barrel. That got put in the barrel at some point.
But like a year ago, this was like a 10-year ago.
Yes.
Thing. I don't know if there's anything else that is quite on that level. We need to keep this podcast going long enough to do the Enter the Matrix episode. That is true.
Yes, I will haunt you forever if I somehow die before we record Enter the Matrix podcast.
I'm imagining you having died, and I bring to your fucking gravestone a long extension cord, an Xbox, and an old CRT TV, and I'm just playing Enter the Matrix and drinking from a big thing of whiskey right there over your grave. I drink, I pour one out, I play the game, I cry. It's going to be great.
No, I'm thinking like what I'm imagining is you're like in your room at night, and then all of a sudden like your laptop just turns on mysteriously, and you wake up and it's like, what's it? And you go over and the web browser's open and it's at your Google Drive and you see the podcast shared Google Drive folder and there's just a mysterious Audacity file in there with just like it's just like wingdings or some shit. There's no text, and you open it up and it's just like you don't hear anything at first. There's like this weird waveform and then you just hear like this ghostly voice. It's just my half of a conversation talking about Enter the Matrix. And then you have to record your half of the podcast within 7 days or I will come out of your PC and kill you.